Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Open Classroom. I'm Janet Gillow, Director of Professional Development for the Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis. So happy to have you with us at today's Open Classroom. When the Brown School had to close our physical location to guests back in March, we created this as an opportunity for visitors, students, alums to join lectures and activities happening at the school. And today is a remarkable example of that. We've partnered with the ICHAD Smart Africa Center, and you're also kind of getting a sneak peek in Dr. Fred's afternoon class, guest lecture by one of his friends and distinguished colleagues. Before we get started with today's program, I just want to let you know what we have coming up next week, because it is truly a remarkable week for Open Classroom. The Brown School is participating in a national teach-in regarding systemic racism. And so we have two programs that are our offering to that nationwide endeavor. On Tuesday at 12:30 Central, we have a program called George Floyd in Context, a historical perspective on racial violence in the United States. Dr. Mike Pfeiffer is joining us from John Jay College City, University of New York. And then Wednesday, 11 a.m., so a week from tomorrow, we are partnering with the American Academies on Social Work and Social Welfare to do a panel presentation on systemic racism and poverty. We got Dr. Larry Davis from University of Pittsburgh, Michael Lindsay from New York University, and the Brown School's Mark Rank for that panel presentation. So now I'd like to turn things over to my friend and colleague, Laura Peer, who's the training manager for ICHAD Smart Africa, to talk to you about today's program.
Got it. Thank you, Janet. I think we're going to have dueling barking dogs in our background today, and that's just the day we're going to have. Thank you so much. So I'm really honored to kind of be the coordinator of the speaker series, the ICHAD Smart Africa Center speaker series. It's usually live. You know, the pandemic has brought a lot of challenges, but I think in this case, it's an opportunity. So we're able to bring speakers from all over the country, all over the world. So we're very excited to have Dr. Santelli here. Upcoming dates for our next speaker series events, which will be again partnering with Open Classroom, our November 17th from 3 to 4, same time slot, 3 to 4 p.m. Central. And then December 8th. Oh, and the topic, we're still confirming the details on that, but we'll announce that very soon. Who will be our speaker. And then December 8th from 3 to 4 p.m. Central, we'll have Dr. Elijah Paintsell, who is with Yale. And so we'll have a great talk with him and his work. And he's a longtime collaborator of Dr. Fred Silamola. So I'm gonna turn it over to Dr. Fred now to introduce our speaker. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Laura. And thank you so much, Professor John Santelli, for accepting to do this. And thank you so much, Janet, and the Open Classroom. My name is Fred Silamola. I have the honor and pleasure of directing two centers, the International Center for Child Health and Development, located within Brown School, but with offices all over the globe, and then also Smart Africa Center, located within the Brown School, and working across Sub-Saharan Africa. So today we have a colleague, a friend, and I call him a brother, Professor John Santelli, with whom we worked and we continue to work. John and I met when I was at Columbia University, and John was the chair of their Department of Population and Family Health, their School of Public Health, for close to 15 years, from 2014 to 2016. He's currently the Professor of Population and Family Health and Pediatrics, still at Columbia University. Both John and I serve on the editorial board of the Journal of Adolescent Health, and he's the past president of the Society of Adolescent Health and Medicine. He has worked on various policy initiatives, especially around issues related to HIV and STD, risk behaviors, trends in teen pregnancy, and programs which are related to prevention or preventing that. Prior to going to Columbia University, Professor John Santelli spent over 18 years working both in local and national public health institutions, including CDC, where I spent a substantial amount of the Center for Disease Control, which of course now everyone should know, given their role with coronavirus. So John was there. John is a medical doctor by training, but he understands social sciences very well. We both work in Sub-Saharan Africa, and we are both on each other's grants in a way. So I'm extremely grateful that John gets to share his work, 25 years of doing HIV work. So John, you are welcome, and thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you very much, Brother Fred. It's always a pleasure to see you. It's always a pleasure when we get together to talk about things. I have a lot of Fred stories, but maybe I should only tell one because otherwise I won't have time to talk about the science. But Fred and I both were at Columbia. We both work on the same issues, HIV and adolescence and risk, and we'd never met. And so we met at a conference one day. I think it was at the CPRC. I just got off a CPRC meeting, the Pop Center. And Fred says, and I said, well, Fred, I work in Uganda. He says, oh, I grew up in Uganda. And I said, well, I work in Rakai. He says, I work in Rakai. Anyway, we've been fast friends ever since then and collaborators. And Fred, you folks at WashU should realize what a treasure it is to have Fred Somal on your faculty. We miss you in New York, but he comes back to visit us at least. Anyway. Okay, let me see if I can share my side. I'm really pleased to meet all of you today. This should be fun. I'm going to give you a bit of an update on some of the work I've been doing. Let me see if I can get my slides to work. It'll go better that way. Does that look good? Can you see some beautiful children?
Yeah, just get in the presentation mode.
Is that in presentation mode?
It's not.
Is that better?
That's better, John. Thank you.
Okay. So anyway, I want to talk about some of the work that I've been doing over the last bunch of years on something called I have to figure out how to advance the slides. Okay, on something called the STAR project. And I'm going to weave together, this is a whole jumble of words here, but I'm going to try to weave together orphanhood, education, poverty, HIV prevention, and youth, and look at data over 25 years in Rakai, Uganda. So hold on to your hat, and hopefully this will be interesting and fun for you all. So I need to thank a lot of people who've raised me up. I've got a great team at Columbia, including Jennifer Hirsch and Susie Hoffman and some other folks, and good folks too at Johns Hopkins, Larry Chang and Ron Gray, Maria Wayward, who Ron and Maria actually started the Rakai project, which I'll talk about. Dr. Fred and William Bianci are two of our collaborators, and I'll explain how they're working with us on Orphanhood. And of course, there's a great group at the Rakai Health Sciences program in Uganda. Fred Nalgoda, who's my co-PI, and Tom Lutalo, who we often hang out and talk about statistics together. Great. So this is my outline today. I want to ask the basic question: why are young people in sub-Saharan Africa continuing to become infected with HIV? Why, we're now 30 plus years into this epidemic. Why do we still see young people getting infected? And is there hope for some future prevention? Of course, Fred does great intervention kinds of projects. Most of my work has actually been studying social dynamics, social trends, but also programs and policies And I'm going to try to weave those two together today for you. So I'll give you a little sense of Uganda and HIV and Rakai, talk to you about the so-called STAR project, which is looking at social determinants and adolescent social transition. It's a mixed methods research project. Talk a lot about trends and risk factors, the role of education and policies and programs, as I mentioned. I'll talk a little bit about the tension between biomedical and behavioral approaches. You know, I graduated medical school about the same time as that CDC original MMWR came out about these mysterious cases of immunodeficiency in Los Angeles and San Francisco and New York. And back then, we said the only thing we had for prevention was behavior change. And of course, that's changed dramatically with the availability of things like PrEP and combination prevention and treatment as prevention. But I'm an old guy, so I'm going to try to talk about both of those. And I'm going to end up talking about our Orphanhood study. Okay. So there's lots of, what should we say, reasons why youth are at higher risk. And there's a variety of risk and protective factors that we can think about. You know, clearly things like sexual initiation and gender. Young women are much higher risk than young men for a number of behavioral reasons. Things like number of sexual partners or sexual concurrency, barrier use or non-use of barrier protection. Male medical circumcision. Fred, if your folks heard a lot about male medical circumcision?
Not much, not much.
Okay, so I'm going to mention some of that important behavioral, that, let's say, really a biological behavioral risk factor. Sexually transmitted diseases often coexist with HIV, and that may relate to biological mechanisms again, or behavioral risk. Things like community prevalence. So if you're having sex and you're engaging in certain kinds of sexual behaviors and you're in a high risk or a high prevalence community, you're at much higher risk. Or if the people you're having sex with have a much higher viral load, you're also at increased risk. So those biobehavioral factors are important, but it's also, and I think we know this, a lot of other social structural factors influence HIV risk. Socioeconomic status or poverty is related. Social stigma is related to this viral infection. Educational, vocational opportunities. And particularly in a place like Uganda, where education has exploded in the sense that kids now have much better access to the public schools, but it's imperfect. We really see the effects of education, and I'll show you some of that data today. Power dynamics and relationships and women's equality is important. It's primarily a heterosexual epidemic in Uganda. And so the role of women, the empowerment of women, empowerment of youth are all really important factors. Occupational risk is another good one. So we have fishing villages on the lakes, on the shores of Lake Victoria, and see really what we call hotspots of much higher risk for HIV in those communities. And finally, migration. Young people, you're all, I don't know, maybe some of you folks at the Brown School are still living at home, but many of us migrate for school, for work, and it's most common among young people. So that also puts folks at risk. Okay, so let me turn to Uganda. Uganda is this, the Pearl of Africa, someone once called it, but it's this beautiful, beautiful country, very green, right on the equator. The Rakai district wraps Lake Victoria. But it's got a fairly considerable HIV prevalence rate. It's about 6 to 7 today. And many AIDS orphans, because many parents at one point got HIV, and died in the period before treatment was available. And many people call it an early success story in the sense that Uganda brought down its HIV prevalence early on. Okay, so what's the Rakai district? It's that area outlined in red. It's in the southern part of the country, again on the shores of Lake Victoria. It's also, it's on both north-south trucking routes in East Africa, but also east-west, the Trans-African Highway. But importantly for this talk today, it's where Slim disease was discovered in 1984 by a colleague of ours, Dr. David Serwata. And what David was, he was a medical trainee and oncology fellow and was sent down to Rakai to figure out what was going on with Slim disease. And he recognized that the disease that was killing folks in Rakai was also the same disease that seemed to be killing young people in Los Angeles and San Francisco in the United States. So I'll fast forward, but that early work between David Serwata and Nelson Sewan-Kambo, Ron Gray, and Maria Wayward, and the four of them are still sort of the leading lights, if you will, in the Rakai Health Sciences program. They started a cohort in 1994, which continues today. And that's going to be the basis for the work I'm doing there. So the Rakai Health Sciences program is many things. It's treatment programs, it's education prevention programs, it's condom availability, it's family planning program, it's primary care. But at its core is this long-running cohort study, now 26 years since 1994. And built on that cohort are all of these epidemiologic studies, prevention studies, randomized clinical trials that have really illuminated our understanding about HIV in sub-Saharan Africa, in fact, the world. And I'll show you a few of their findings in a minute. But for the purposes of understanding my talk today, I need to say a little bit about the Rakai Community Cohort Study, or RCCS. It's been going on. It's a so-called open cohort. That means people enter and leave the cohort. It's a cohort of people 15 to 49 years of age, and it exists in 50 communities. Now, of those 50 communities, some have come and some have gone, and about half of those communities have been under continuous surveillance, by which I mean we've been able to follow those same communities, those same villages, those same households in those villages for now, 26 years. There's also considerable amount of in and out migration. So that's why it's an open cohort. Young people may join the cohort, say at 15 or 16. They may out-migrate to go to school, to a boarding school. They may finish school at 18. They may then move to the capital or move to Masaka, the regional capital, and then they may move back. So there's a huge amount of migration for education, for marriage, for work that goes on. So as part of the cohort, there's an annual survey where they can obtain informed consent. They do prevention services like HIV testing, but also education and counseling. And they do a survey approximately annually, looking at behavior, sexual networks, service utilization. They collect biological specimens for things like HIV and STI testing. And again, I've mentioned a couple times now that these multiple prevention services, you can't study people and not try to prevent the epidemic. So they do their best to educate, to provide condoms, free condoms, to provide counseling and testing. They now provide male medical circumcision, MMC. They provide treatment, antiretroviral treatment, and they provide family planning. There's a considerable amount of work to engage the community, community fathers and mothers, the political leadership, but also outspoken members of the community to help guide them in doing good prevention work and good research. And they have very high participation rates in the cohort study. So it's amazing to think. I mean, I think Rakai is one of the longest existing epidemiological cohorts in sub-Saharan Africa. But these are some of the research that's been done there. Mass STI treatment trials, the importance of understanding viral load in HIV transmission, which is the basis now of treatment as prevention. It's the basis for controlling a person's viral load if they're HIV positive. That original work by Tom Quinn was done in Rakai, not in the US, but in sub-Saharan Africa. They've identified epidemiological hotspots for HIV transmission. They did one of the 3 randomized clinical trials of male medical circumcision. This is circumcision on an adolescent and adult males, and showed that that's simple. I shouldn't say simple. That surgical procedure prevents about 60% of transmission from women to men. They've also figured out things like the importance of what's called combination prevention. And combination prevention is the notion that there's no single cure, there's no single prevention effort that's going to do everything for everybody. And so I'll show you that data in a second, but prevention is this notion that we need education, we need condoms, we need behavior change, but we also need things like ART to lower viral load in the population to reduce the amount of virus literally in the population. And we need things like male medical circumcision as well. They've done studies on the linkage between HIV prevention and reproductive health and contraception. They've done spatial clustering studies, and importantly, they're able to look at HIV incidence. I think, well, I learned this in the 80s, but HIV prevalence tells you where the epidemic has been. HIV incidence tells you where it's going. And so it's really hard to get data on HIV incidence. You have to follow someone over time, and a cohort study becomes a great way to do that. So, I'm going to show you one study from my colleagues. And this is a study published in the New England Journal 3 years ago, showing that the red line is showing you essentially HIV prevalence in the Rakai cohort over time. So you've got time on the x-axis on the bottom, and HIV prevalence on the left in red, and then HIV incidence in blue on the right. And what they found after the scale up of CHP, combination HIV prevention, was that even though prevalence didn't change very much, suddenly incidence began to drop. This was so around 2010, between 2009 and 2011, HIV incidence had dropped by about 42%. And I won't go into all the statistical issues. And this is important for what I'm going to say about STAR. 3 factors seem to be driving this big drop in HIV incidence. Part of it was ART, the availability of ART, because if you can get most people in a community on antiretroviral therapy, they live longer and they're healthier, okay? This is ART coverage on the left bar chart. But if people who are HIV positive get on ART, they live longer, they're healthier, but they're less likely to spread it to their partners. So treatment is prevention in that sense. And the other big change that they've seen in Rakai is male medical circumcision, which is the bar chart on the right. So dramatic changes in those two components of, what should we say, of combination prevention. So keep that in mind as I get on to talking about orphanhood. The third thing they found was a remarkable decrease in sexual experience among adolescents, only found among adolescents, and found among adolescent boys and girls. And that's part of the story today as well. Okay, so let me talk then about STAR, and it's, you can't have a research project without a good acronym. So again, we're looking at structural determinants and social transitions. Social transitions are things like leaving school, migrating, getting married, having your first child. Those are all important transitions, if you will, in the life of an adolescent or young adult. And they all are accompanied by changes in HIV risk. So the STAR project builds upon two prior projects. One was called the Rakai Youth Project, which looked at particularly at trends and risk factors for HIV incidence, but also did ethnographic studies, studies on migration, incidence versus prevalence, factors related to initiation of sexual intercourse and schooling. Something called the Linkages Project, which really looked at reproductive health. And again, some of the key themes that jumped out at us were particularly schooling, and that transition out of school, that leaving school, put young people at much higher risk of HIV, something we had thought about a little bit, but hadn't really expected to be such an important risk factor. And of course, Dr. Fred does a lot of work at trying to keep young people in school because education is good for you. I think we all agree on that. And, but it's also good in terms of preventing HIV infection. So again, the rationale for the STAR project is that we hope that by understanding these social processes that produce HIV risk or protect young people from HIV infection, we may be able to make suggestions about the next generation of HIV prevention programs. And again, the second part of this, it's important to look beyond individual characteristics and behaviors, to think about how social structural forces shape behaviors or shape risk in general. How does education, why does staying in school put people, protect young people? Why does being a young woman, a young adolescent woman in Rakai put you at higher risk than being an adolescent male? And so we're looking at those social structural factors. We're also looking at how, at the timing of adolescent and young adult social transitions. So this is our complicated, slightly complicated logic model, if you will. And let me unpack it a little bit. And maybe I'll take if you have questions about this, let me give you a little time to think about this. But what this says is over on the right, we have biological outcomes, things like pregnancy or sexually transmitted infections or HIV. And this is a basic notion from demographic studies. There are biological and behavioral proximate factors that predict those. So if you're having sex, you're more likely to get pregnant or you're more likely to get HIV. But it's not only are you having sex, it's who you're having sex with and whether you're using barrier protection or contraception. Importantly for STIs and HIV, partner-related factors are critical. So you can be having frequent sex. If you're having frequent sex with a single partner, you're at pretty low risk of HIV as long as your partner is not infected. So those behaviors are critical to pregnancy and STDs. Male medical circumcision also seems to be critical in preventing STIs and HIV. And again, I've mentioned this already, but the prevalence of HIV in a community, as measured by how many people are infected or how high the viral load is in the community, is it's a pretty darn specific and highly predictive risk factor. So we've done studies in San Francisco, for instance, and shown that as we get a large portion of the San Francisco population on ART, viral load drops and new infections drop. Okay, so the right side are these proximal factors. But looking to the left, what's driving these behaviors? You need to look at social structural determinants, things like SES, socioeconomic status, access to school, household structure, family structure, if you will, gender, and there are certain occupations that are put you at risk. There are also policies. So what's the Uganda national policy around education? It turns out that in 1997, the country under President Museveni declared pretty early in East Africa that we want everybody in East Africa to everybody in Uganda to get a primary education. That was a big advance. And I'll show you the data on that in a second. Things like, what are the policies about male medical circumcision or ART? Is ART actually available to people in a country? And what are your policies and programs about health education or ABC? So those social structural determinants and policies and programs then work through the individual in terms of the timing of their social transitions. When do they leave school? How do they form relationships or initiate sexual behaviors and migrate? And they also affect factors like gender socialization, desire for children, alcohol use and other risk-taking, youth resiliency, perceived risk. So in the course of the youth project and now in STAR, we've tried to look at every box on this page. And we find robust and pretty strong relationships between many of these factors. So let me see if I can get the little circles to show up. So what affects school leaving? Leaving school early. Educational policy does. What does school leaving do? It really changes the probability of engaging in sexual behavior. And it really then affects things like adolescent pregnancy and HIV. And again, we've, in various papers for the Rakai Youth Project, tried to trace those out. Maybe I should stop for a second. I haven't lost you yet, have I? Is this making sense to folks? Do people have questions about this?
Laura is monitoring the chat room. Am I right, Laura?
Yeah, I've invited people to submit their questions. So as questions pop up, I will definitely let you know, Dr. Santelli.
Okay.
Right now, it's pretty quiet.
Pretty quiet. Okay, people are listening. Okay. Again, feel free to ask. I can't see the chat, so I'll let Laura remind me.
Yeah, we do. Now we have a couple. They've heeded the call. So is timing of social transitions considered from a deficit perspective? I understand transitions can be challenging. Is it ideal to argue that if these are handled well, they can be protective against HIV?
No, for sure. So if you build schools, if you, as Fred has done, if you provide incentives to families to stay in school and pay for things like school uniforms and other things that kids need to go in books, sure, you can keep kids in school. They have, obviously there's educational benefits to that, but it also changes the pattern of sexual behaviors that young people engage in. So I guess you'd think of that from a resiliency perspective or an assets perspective if you want to think about education that way, for sure.
Great, and we have another one, an interesting question. Why the focus on male medical circumcision, which is non-reversible, and not something like PrEP, for example?
Well, it's both. The story on male medical circumcision is that epidemiologists 20 years ago realized, looking across the continent of Africa, that in parts of the continent that had higher rates of male circumcision, primarily because of religious reasons. So West Africa, North Africa, there was much lower HIV infection rates. So folks studied that for 20 years, and then at the end of that period decided, well, the only way to know if this really, the only way to develop the definitive evidence on this would be to do a randomized clinical trial. And 3 of those were done. All of them found one in Kenya, one in Uganda that was part of the Rakai project, and one in South Africa, and all found the same result, a 60% reduction in HIV transmission from women to men. So it protects men at every age from new infection. Now, on the basis of that, WHO made recommendations. I'll show you the Rakai data in a second again, but we see very high rates today in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and we're seeing declining HIV incidence, new infections, if you will. Other questions, Laura?
Not as of yet, but I'll pop in as questions arise.
And how are we doing on time? We've got 20 minutes.
20 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to keep going on. So I think I've described the specific aims informally. We're doing a large number of studies looking at qualitative and quantitative. And let me skip over that today. I want to describe 3 specific studies. We're also doing many ethnographic studies, trying to understand the mechanisms by which infections occur. So this is the 24-year increase in education. You can, in school enrollment, if you will, among these are adolescent women. You see a similar pattern for young men between 94 and 2018. And you can see this, and these lines are single year of age. So you can see for 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds. I think it's, and the dotted blue line is universal primary education. You can see, in every ICHAD, in every age group, we've seen, remarkable increases in the number of young people enrolled in school. This is the other remarkable change we've seen in terms of social determinants is huge increases in socioeconomic status. And this is socioeconomic status based on family wealth, household wealth, things like ownership of motorcycles and electricity in the home and modern construction. But this is a new SES index that we put together actually for STAR. But you can see the highest group has increased pretty dramatically, and the very poor group, the so-called low SES, has shrunk considerably. Okay. So what I want to try to give you just a taste of the data and then talk about orphanhood, give you a little sense of how some of these social determinants are affecting issues like child marriage, HIV incidence, and then orphanhood. So child marriage is what should we say? It's now a global goal to reduce marriage among young people under the age of 18. There's a lot of social and health reasons for that, but it's really been a global campaign to reduce child marriage everywhere over time. And the things that seem to put young women at risk tend to be poverty and lack of education, but also things like social and gender norms that propel young women out of school and into marriage. It's been related to things like spousal abuse and maternal and child mortality. So the good news is child marriage is going down all around the globe. It's dropped most considerably in South Asia, where it was highest, but you can see East and South Africa has also showed a good decline. And this is work that our project director, Esther Spindler, is working on over these 24 years. National data from Uganda suggest a third of young women, young adult women, 2024 were married before the age of 18. That's from a national survey. And, but again, Rakai has experienced these drastic reductions. And you can see in the bottom figure that marital rates drop pretty considerably. They've gone from 28% of adolescents to 6%. At the same time, secondary schooling has shot up. So we think obviously this is the early data. Esther is going to do a dissertation on this, and we're excited to see what she finds in terms of tracking this both qualitatively and quantitatively. These are, again, the mirror image of that school slide. You can see, obviously, marriage is highest among the 19-year-olds, but look at these drops at every age, 15, 16, 17, has dropped really considerably between 1994 and 2018. So the second study I want to mention is we're now trying to look at HIV incidence again and look at it in the face of some of these social and structural and policy issues. So we're seeing declines in HIV incidence and prevalence in youth, but we're also seeing declining HIV incidence, if you will, among adults in Rakai. And I showed you that data a minute ago from Kate Grubowski. And it looks like this so-called combination prevention, ART and male medical circumcision, is what's driving this among the adults and sexual experience among adolescents. So how are these working together? So again, this is the decline in prevalence. The highest prevalence started out among 20 to 24-year-old women. You can see women either among young adults or in the adolescent group are at higher risk, but the lines are going down, and that's the good news. You can see some changes in behaviors or biological risk factors. So you can see the circumcision line, which has jumped up. That's the blue line, particularly among young men. Very little change in consistent condom use, and it stayed about a third among young people, but a big decline in sexual activity. And again, the same data for women, again, marked decline in sexual activity, increase of circumcision among their primary partner, but not a big change in condom use. And in this study, we're seeing, again, these marked increases in several things. ART use in red, this is the proportion of HIV persons in the population, HIV positive persons in the population that are using ART. And the other is male medical circumcision, which has gone from, around 18%. Now it's closer to 70%.
Santelli?
Yes.
What caused the change in male medical circumcision?
I mean, so they did a trial of circumcision, MMC, or safe medical circumcision, in Rakai between 2004 and 2006. And immediately afterwards made the surgical service, if you will, the prevention service available in the community. And they've had very good uptake. I mean, it took a while, you can see. It's slowly risen over time. This is essentially about 12 years of time, but it's now, we'll have the new data soon, but it's now over 70% of men in the community. It's higher among adolescents. So it's really showing that this worked, making it widely available in the community, and educating the Rakai population about this. I dare say the rates are probably higher in Rakai than they are elsewhere, and that's because it's in some ways Rakai is a model for treatment and prevention. But it's it's going up around East Africa and South Africa.
And are they doing the circumcision when they're babies, like we do?
No, I mean they are now, but initially they rolled it out for adolescent and adult men, because if you start with babies, you'd have to wait 20 years, literally, to see the protective effect. So the decision was made. So it's a more involved surgery among adults, but yeah. I mean, the healing period is 2 to 3 weeks, whereas a baby, I used to do pediatric circumcision when I was a practicing pediatrician, and they heal up in 2 days. But anyway, to have a major impact on HIV, you have to do it among those most at risk. Other questions, Laura?
Yeah, thank you. And there's another question. What do the men who are circumcised feel about it? Possible sexual functioning, pleasure, pain issues seem like a high trade-off, especially when there are other preventive measures available.
Yeah, with good, in the best possible circumstances, with good education about potential side effects, all of which are short-term. Generally, it's been very positive. People approve of it aesthetically, partners approve of it, but there are a few long-term effects. Surgical risk is pretty low. It's a pretty safe surgical procedure, again, in good hands. Again, I would say higher acceptance among adolescents than among adult men. So we've seen very good acceptance. There's a plethora of literature on this, but which I probably, if I'm going to get done today, I probably shouldn't describe all of it. But again, it's been generally a positive experience.
Great, and we do have a couple more questions, and just a quick time check. It's 10 minutes to the hour. But William is asking, great presentation, John. Could you talk about building collaboration and networking in an international local setting for junior faculty?
Oh my God, William, we have to talk about that afterwards. I would say Rakai it's been a great pleasure to work in, but it's been a great collaboration between the major universities, Makerere in Uganda, Columbia, Johns Hopkins, and between the people, so that there is a ready camaraderie among the scientific staff. It's very much run by Ugandans. So there's many good things to say about it, but I'm never going to get onto Orphanhood if I happy to chat with William afterwards. Maybe one more question, and then
Yeah.
Orphanhood.
Okay, and the final one is the disproportion between the prevention factors and the HIV prevalence in this specific graphic is noticeable. Why is the impact so slow?
Aha, okay. So ART does two things. It prevents new infection, but it also keeps you alive. So actually, we're seeing increases in prevalence in Rakai, particularly among the older groups, because they're living longer. And we're seeing declines in incidence all at the same time. So the transmission dynamics get complex. Yeah. Let me try to finish up here, and then I can spend some time. So we're now looking at how all of these factors interrelate. So again, enrollment in school reduces HIV incident risk. Getting married for women prevents it. Getting divorced increases it. Multiple partners increases it. We're seeing decreases among people who are more wealthy, or the other way to say that, those who are poor seem to be at increased risk. And we're seeing, we're still working this out, but we're seeing an impact of both male medical circumcision and community HIV levels in shaping HIV incident risk. So let me turn now to orphanhood. So I don't know if all of you know this, but orphanhood really dramatically increased in East Africa, Southern Africa, many countries because of HIV in the 1980s and 90s. So we've lost between 1990 and 2015, UNICEF estimates we lost 13 million children and adolescents, or I should say 13 million children and adolescents lost one or both parents. Orphanhood is not good for you. Dr. Fred, of course, works with orphans in Masaka and Rakai, but there's a variety of adverse health and social consequences. It's not good to lose your parents. You're not good to lose that support system. So we see school dropouts, we see increased HIV infection and things like child marriage. So what might ART or some of these structural factors, structural determinants, how might they affect orphanhood? So an early paper from Rakai, from Fred Makumbi, demonstrated an impact of ART among on orphanhood among children under 15, mostly the youngest kids. And so what we have been doing is looking at what's the impact. This is our logic model for how do things like SCS and HIV prevalence and ART and male circumcision affect orphanhood. We used, again, the Rakai data. I shouldn't go into all the details today, but we used data from the household, from the RCCS questionnaire, the HIV testing data. And in particular, we looked at these three community level independent variables: prevalence of ART, prevalence of HIV, and prevalence of male medical circumcision. And we looked at these three outcomes: double orphanhood, maternal orphanhood, essentially the death of your mom; paternal orphanhood, death of your dad. And we used what's called multinomial logistic regression, which is a nice method for studying an issue like orphanhood, because these three outcomes are all related. And we looked at timing. So this is the change in orphanhood in Rakai over time. This is looking at 20-year data. The paper looks at a slightly shorter period. But you can see with the red bars at the top are having lost both parents. And in 2004, essentially almost a quarter of young people, adolescents, had lost one or both parents. That rate is now down to 3%. Overall orphanhood was over 50% in 2005. And today it's essentially about a quarter. So dramatic declines in orphanhood over time in the Rakai cohort. Again, I showed you this slide. We're going to try then to relate these factors to it. This is our multinomial logistic regression model, and these are called the RRRs are called relative risk. So all the coefficients have been converted. So a relative risk of 1 is not a risk, and a relative risk greater than 1 means an increase in risk. So I just point out a couple of things: that the age of the adolescent is related to increased risk. The older you get, the more likely you lose. hard to lose a parent. Living in a trading village also increases risk. But look at some of these variables. Community HIV prevalence also increases risk. Now that makes sense. If you're living in a higher prevalence community, you're more likely to lose parents. ART use on a community level also seems to be working to lower orphanhood risk. Male medical circumcision, on the other hand, seems to very specifically reduce orphanhood, paternal orphanhood. Now that makes sense because it protects male medical circumcision initially protects the man from getting infected. So anyway, and socioeconomic status was also, so those in the highest status bracket, had a 20 to 50% reduction in risk compared to the low SES category. Okay, I got to wrap it up here.
Yeah, we have 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay. So I got 2 more slides. I think on the orphanhood, what we're finding is that availability of ART and male circumcision has led to dramatic declines in orphanhood. SES and declining HIV prevalence have also contributed to that. And I think we're going to promote the vision that reduction in orphanhood should be considered one of the triumphs of treatment as prevention. The US government has spent a lot of money, billions of dollars every year on treatment as prevention in sub-Saharan Africa. And we should claim credit for those programs in reducing orphanhood. The more general summary I'd make today is I think major changes in the social context for youth over the past 20 years have occurred. Things like access to education and SES have risen pretty dramatically. Orphanhood has declined. And we've seen both improvements in things like child marriage and in sexual experience. And access to education has contributed to this declining HIV risk and HIV incidence. And again, combination HIV prevention has contributed. And let me just wrap up by saying, I mentioned the dilemma, should we focus on behaviors or should we focus on biomedical solutions? And I think my sense from our data in Rakai is that both are pretty essential in the fight to prevent HIV and AIDS. Okay, final questions.
John, that was excellent. As always, we couldn't have asked for a better presenter. Thank you so much, my brother. Thank you so much, my colleague. Thanks so much, my co-scientist. Thank you. This was excellent. And there are lots of kudos in the chat room. Thank you very, very much. I know we don't have time, so thank you.
Brad, thank you, brother.